In 1619, 90 unmarried women arrived in the colonies for purchase. They were viewed as commodities for the settlers, who were mostly young, unmarried men. Marriage was seen as an economic relationship. Puritans believed that a woman should be subordinate to her husband and her most important job should be raising God-fearing children. Under coverture, women had no right to buy or sell property. Strong, independent women were seen as a threat. In the 1630s, Anne Hutchinson was banished by John Winthrop for challenging the Puritan doctrine by saying that living a holy life was no guarantee of salvation. This became known as antinomianism. This fear of strong women is also exemplified in the Salem witch trials of 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts, where 178 people were accused of witchcraft and more than 3 out of 4 of them were women. Many of the women convicted did not fit into the subordinate role, and a large number were unmarried property-owning widows. This illustrates the patriarchal society in which women were viewed as inferior to men, and women who stood out were not accepted. As the economy grew, new occupations were available for women, including weaving, tailoring, and teaching. Immigrants living in German and Dutch communities viewed the role of women differently. They would work in the fields and could own items and had more control over property than English women. Slave women were viewed as little more than objects and were frequently abused by their owners and were not protected by the law or the court. In 1767, tax-supported optional schooling for girls began, though many communities proved reluctant to do this. Girls were encouraged only to learn to read in order to read religious materials, and few learned to write because they had no use for it. In the 1740s, the Great Awakening, which stemmed from the rise of Enlightenment thought, gave women opportunity to participate in the public sphere. They were highly active in Methodist and Baptist churches, and while they couldn't preach, they had a say in church affairs. During the beginning of the American Revolution, the colonists boycotted many British goods. Women took an active role in encouraging these boycotts. The Daughters of Liberty used their sewing skills to produce goods that couldn't be obtained. Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, was very influential on her husband. She advocated for more liberal women's rights. After the Revolution, Republican motherhood transitioned into the cult of domesticity, which held that men worked in the public sphere and women stayed in the home and took care of the children. Despite this, some women did work outside the home. The rapid growth of textile manufacturing created a need for workers, and many young women moved to work in the mills. During the 19th century, many women became primary supporters of reform efforts. They pushed temperance against the demon rum because they and their children were the primary victims of its abuse. By 1855, 13 of 30 states had temperance laws. Dorothea Dix was an activist who advocated on behalf of the insane and who was central to penal reform. She established state mental hospitals in numerous states and created the first penitentiary in Auburn, New York in 1821.
Furthering women's rights. Women's colleges were established, including Troy and Mount Holyoke. The Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 jump-started the first wave of feminism. They produced the Declaration of Sentiments, which expressed their grievances towards the way men treated women. Prominent leaders of this movement included Lucretia Mott, a Quaker and a women's rights activist, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a social activist. Both these women and many others were highly involved in this abolitionist effort. The Grimke sisters traveled around the nation lecturing on the evils of slavery. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, a national bestseller that illustrated how slavery tears families apart. Several African American women, including Sojourner Truth, gave speeches on African American rights. During the Civil War, women were involved in the war efforts even though they were not allowed to fight. A few dressed as men to fight and thousands served as nurses. After the war, many women were widowed. Many of them embraced not having to be married, and divorce became more common. In the South, the concept of a new woman emerged, one who was independent and self-sufficient. A large number of elite women began to do their own housework, and many sought jobs outside the home. The introduction of the railroad in 1870s allowed people the opportunity to settle the Great Plains. Women living in the Midwest had a large amount of freedom and were expected to do housework and be independent. By the end of the 18th century, a few Western states had granted women full voting rights. In 1869, Wyoming became the first territory and state in America to grant women's suffrage. Jane Addams was a social worker who turned the nation's attention to the need of mothers. She established the Hull House as a safe haven for immigrant women. They continued to push for suffrage, although many rural politicians were hostile to their cause. In 1917, the National Women's Party began picketing the White House. Several of these women were arrested for obstructing traffic. This illustrates the public opposition towards women's suffrage. During World War I, tens of thousands of women served as nurses. Unlike in the Civil War, women were allowed in these armed forces, and 300 women served in the Marines, performing duties within the United States so that the male Marines could fight overseas. On the home front, women played an important role in assisting with volunteer services and social services. In the absence of men who were fighting overseas, women took up their jobs in factories, admitting women into workforce in great numbers. Once the war was over, though, women were expected to return to the home. At the end of the war, Congress passed the 19th Amendment in 1920, which granted women's suffrage. This finally fulfilled the primary goal of women who kick-started the suffrage movement 80 years earlier. The Roaring Twenties saw the emergence of the new woman, who was less concerned with the social reform and more with the personal fulfillment, believing that it was possible to pursue both a family and a career. Young women embrace the sexual revolution taking place. Flappers ignore social and sexual norms by cutting their hair and wearing short skirts. Despite this liberation, out of the era emerged the feminine mystique, which said the woman's place was in the home.
During the Great Depression, white women's unemployment rate was actually lower than that of white men because women were paid less. In the 1930s, birth control became a highly debated topic, with Margaret Sanger spearheading the movement in favor of its legislation. During World War II, millions of women entered the workforce to fulfill the jobs left unoccupied by men fighting overseas. Rosie the Riveter became a popular icon amongst working women. Women often found themselves working in bombing defense industries. Women also found other ways to support the war efforts through organizations like Women's Army Auxiliation Corps, which supported the war in non-combat ways, and Women Air Force pilots. In 1950s, women were called back to a domestic life of taking care of the children. In 1960s, there were a resurgence of sexual revolution with the emergence of birth control pills and the invention of the bikini. In 1963, Betty Friedan, a women's